Glenochil Prison near Tullibody is the only prison in Clackmannanshire. Built on land purchased from the National Coal Board, it sits on the site of the former Glenochil colliery. Over the years, it has seen its fair share of controversy and has housed a number of high-profile prisoners, such as Paul Ferris, known as the Wee Man, and convicted murderers Angus Sinclair and Bill McDowell. In recent years, the prison has been completely rebuilt, including the construction of a new gatehouse, new kitchen and new reception, as well as the erection of a 5.2-metre high wall surrounding the prison, which replaced the security fencing. In early 1952, planning permission was granted to sink a new mine south of Alva, and the site chosen was Glenochil. It was expected to extract 3,000 tonnes of coal a day for the next 50 years. Work began in March 1954, with the expectation of two types of coal being separated on site. West of the main entrance was a 2-storey building housing offices, lamp cabins, stores and workshops. Coal production began in earnest in December 1956, and at its peak in 1960, the workforce amounted to just over 900 workers. In 1957, pithead baths and a canteen were constructed. When the land was sold by the National Coal Board in the 1960s, most of the new Glenochil Detention Centre incorporated this part of the site. Redesigned by Glasgow-based architect Alexander Buchanan Campbell, the baths and canteen, as well as the medical room, were all converted to accommodate prisoners in the early days of the prison. On 1st June 1962, the last shift at Glenochil Colliery was called. The site was sold in the mid-1960s and incorporated into HMP Glenochil in 1966, a new link in the prison system. In the 1970s, HMP Glenochil was extended and became a young offenders institution. In the 1980s, 4 blocks were built to house young adult male offenders until HMYOI Polmont took over these duties in 2003. The 4 blocks or halls are equipped with 124 cells on each of the 3 levels, with each cell having a window to let in natural light. There is also a segregation unit within the prison. It's now one of the main prisons for sex offenders in Scotland and those with a lifelong restriction order, with a capacity of 670. The prisoners are all over 21, male, and are serving 4 or more years. All have come from other prisons following their convictions. Clackmannanshire Council has a dedicated social work team working there as part of the Criminal Justice Service. Their aim is to stop reoffending. During the 1980s, Glenochil saw a spate of suicides and serious assaults between prisoners took place in the mid-2000s, with prison staff also being assaulted by inmates. A riot took place in 1994, and in early 1997, 3 prisoners held a nurse and a prison warder hostage. In November 2014, 2 prison officers were injured in a knife attack, and in February 2018, convicted murderer Michael Mowat was killed when prisoner Stephen McIver attacked him with a homemade knife. He was sentenced to 12 years for the killing. In August 2017, a new support centre opened for families of inmates to provide support and information on financial matters, housing, and the supporting of the children of prisoners. It's run by the Stirling Interfaith Community Justice Group. In March 2020, the prisoners began making their own safes at the site's engineering work sheds to stop others stealing their belongings. Among the prisoners held at Glenochil were Angus Sinclair, who was charged in connection with the World's End murders in Edinburgh in the 1970s, and Bill McDowell, who was found guilty of the murder of Rennie and Andrew McRae. On Saturday, 15th October 1977, two 17-year-old girls went out for a night out in Edinburgh and eventually found their way to the World's End pub in the High Street. The following day, the bodies of Helen Scott, who worked in a kiltmaker's shop on Princes Street, and Christine Eadie, who worked in a chartered accountant's office in the city, were found in East Lothian, 6 miles apart. Both had been beaten, violated, and strangled with their own clothing. Lothian and Borders Police immediately began a murder inquiry, but it would take decades to finally convict one of the men responsible for their deaths. They interviewed hundreds of people, visited numerous pubs in the city where the girls had been, but eventually the case went cold. However, with advances in forensic techniques, DNA was found on Helen's raincoat, and further DNA was found of another man, but neither were on the police database. Then there was a breakthrough. The DNA was a match to Angus Robertson Sinclair, who had a long criminal history and had been in prison since 1982. He'd first been convicted when a teenager for violating and killing 7-year-old Catherine Rehill, and in 2001 had been found guilty of murdering 17-year-old Mary Gallagher in 1976. Later, police would also connect the DNA of the second man in the World's End case to Sinclair's brother-in-law, Gordon Hamilton. In November 2004, 59-year-old Sinclair was detained by police in connection with the murders of Helen and Christine, but it wasn't until March 2005 he was arrested and charged. 2 years later, his trial got underway, and it was during the trial he stated that his brother-in-law, who died in 1996, had forced the girls into a motor vehicle, then drove them to Gosford Bay, where he sexually assaulted and strangled Christine, disposing of her body at the site. He then said Hamilton had attacked and murdered Helen near Haddington, disposing of her body in a field. Sinclair denied murdering them, and due to the court believing there was insufficient evidence, the case was dropped. It was a devastating blow to the families of Helen and Christine. However, the police were tenacious, and thanks to a change in the double jeopardy law in Scotland in 2011, Sinclair once again found himself in the dock. He was the first man in the country to stand trial twice for the same crime. This time he was found guilty on 14th November 2014 of the murders and given a life sentence with a minimum period of 37 years. He died in his cell at Glenochil Prison on 11th March 2019, aged 73. Sinclair was also suspected of killing at least 4 more women. Paul Ferris was 17 when he was convicted of knife attacks on the Welsh brothers, George, Henry and Martin, in Glasgow, who'd tormented him since childhood. He spent 3 months at Glenochil around 1980. A few years later, he worked for Glasgow gangster Arthur Thompson for a time as an enforcer after he came to Thompson's attention. When Arthur Thompson Jr. was murdered in August 1991, Ferris was charged in connection with the shooting, but after the longest murder trial in Scottish history, was found not guilty the following year. Ferris is now an author. William McDowell, known as Bill, was convicted of the murder of Rennie and Andrew McRae, who disappeared in November 1976. The disappearance of the McRaes haunted Inverness for more than 4 decades. The pair had gone missing on Friday 12 November at a lay-by on the A9 near Dalmagary Quarry, around 12 miles south of the Highland capital. She had said she was going to visit her sister Morag Govens in Kilmarnock, but she never appeared. It later transpired her lover William McDowell, the company secretary for McRae & Company in Inverness, had arranged to meet her and had told her in the previous weeks that he was going to leave his wife, Rosemary, so they could begin a new life in Shetland. After Gordon McRae, her estranged husband, had been eliminated from police inquiries, attention turned to McDowell. Evidence in the case was sparse, as Rennie's burned-out BMW gave no clue as to what had happened to the pair, but police were convinced McDowell was behind it. It wasn't until Glenochil Quarry near Culloden was searched and the case was reviewed that McDowell was arrested at his Penrith home in Cumbria. It was also thanks to modern forensic techniques that blood had been found on the boot latch of the burnt-out BMW, which had been kept in storage for 40 years. McDowell's trial took place in September 2022 at the High Court in Inverness, where he pleaded not guilty to murdering 36-year-old Rennie and her 3-year-old son, Andrew, who, it transpired, was in fact McDowell's son. The jury didn't believe him, and by a majority verdict he was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years, meaning he would die in prison. The judge, Ian Armstrong, Lord Armstrong, told him the murders had been premeditated and were executions. McDowell was transferred from HMP Porterfield in Inverness to HMP Glenochil on Wednesday 23 November 2022 due to his complex medical needs. He died at Forth Valley Royal Hospital in Larbert in February 2023, having served less than 6 months of his life sentence. He was 81. The whereabouts of the remains of Rennie and Andrew are still unknown, and the search for them continues. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.